Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're peeling back the mythology of America's origins to figure out who the founders actually were, way beyond those stoic, larger-than-life faces carved into Mount Rushmore. We're going to dig right into the historical record, separate the legends from the reality, and find out why understanding the real, flawed humans behind the myth is absolutely crucial for us today. So let's just jump right in with a question that seems super simple, but actually has a pretty wild answer. Who exactly are the Founding Fathers? It's a phrase we hear constantly in modern politics, right? But where did it actually come from? Believe it or not, that exact term wasn't even a thing until well after the nation was born. It was literally introduced to Americans by Senator Warren G. Harding in a 1916 keynote speech. It's actually a perfect example of how the whole mythos surrounding these men was constructed long after the fact, framing our modern understanding of them as this unified, almost magical group of thinkers. And here's the kicker. The founders themselves completely rejected this whole demigod status. Just look at John Adams. Back in 1811, when people were praising his generation, he shut it down, explicitly writing, "I have no reason to believe we were better than you are. Don't call me father or founder." Adams and his peers just viewed themselves as ordinary citizens trying to navigate some wildly extraordinary challenges, not infallible legends. Section 1. Who are the founders? Demystifying the demigods. Now, even though there were dozens of signers and delegates involved, historian Richard B. Morris famously narrowed it down to what he called the Big Seven. He picked this core group based on a pretty rigorous triple test: leadership, longevity, and statesmanship. These are the guys who basically dominated the early executive branch, the courts, and those early crucial diplomatic missions. But who were they on a day-to-day level? Well, they averaged about 43 years old, though Ben Franklin was the outlier, pushing 81, and they were predominantly wealthy men of British descent. If you break down their day jobs, about half of them were lawyers, 16% were planters, and another 16% were merchants. And knowing this is a real game changer, because it perfectly explains why our founding documents are so deeply obsessed with property rights, commerce, and legal precedents. It really grounds these historical icons into everyday guys with very specific economic interests. Section 2. Forging the Founding Documents, a rapid-fire history. This journey to nationhood wasn't some neat, orderly process. It was chaotic. It was a massive experiment. Starting with the First Continental Congress in 1774, which was really just a unified colonial pushback against British taxes, they moved remarkably fast. Just 2 years later, boom, the Declaration of Independence. By 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ends the war. Then, realizing their first attempt at a government was kind of falling apart, they draft a brand new constitution in 1787 and top it off with the Bill of Rights in 1791. They went from a colonial boycott to a fully structured republic in less than 20 years. Talk about a sprint. But we really can't overstate just how fragile this whole thing was. I mean, the 1787 Constitutional Convention almost completely collapsed. You had this massive, deep impasse between the large and small states over how representation should work. It was literally on the verge of failure. Then, Roger Sherman steps in with the Connecticut Compromise, pitching a proportional House and an equal Senate. And get this, that monumental, nation-saving compromise, it squeaked by with a margin of just 5 states to 4. Literally one single vote changed the entire course of history. Section 3. Beyond the Core 7. Expanding the narrative. Because the reality is, the founding wasn't just a handful of guys hanging out in a room in Philadelphia. It took a massive, incredibly diverse network of people to actually win the revolution. You've got Abigail Adams, a crucial advisor. You have Crispus Attucks, a man of Native American and African descent who was literally the very first person killed in the revolution. There's Cato, an enslaved black patriot and spy whose intel is credited with saving George Washington's life at least twice. And Haym Solomon, the guy who essentially bankrolled the Continental Army. These marginalized voices were absolutely essential to getting this country off the ground. You know, we really have to give credit to the founding mothers as well. Take Abigail Adams. Back in 1776, she sent this incredibly bold warning to her husband. She wrote, "Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." She was explicitly warning them that women would literally start a rebellion if they were shut out of having a voice in the new laws. It's this awesome reminder that the fight for representation was so much bigger than what the guys in Philly were willing to put on paper at the time. Section 4. Liberty, Slavery, and Legacy. The Great Contradiction. Now, we've got to look at a pretty stark juxtaposition here. It's a paradox that historians are still grappling with today. On one hand, 41 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. We're talking George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the heavy hitters. But on the exact same flip side, founders like John Jay and Alexander Hamilton were out there leading early abolition societies in places like New York. So you have this soaring, beautiful rhetoric of liberty being penned by men who, largely, were actively participating in human bondage. And there is a profound irony when you look at Thomas Jefferson specifically. Jefferson himself enslaved around 600 people during his lifetime. Yet, in his very first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he actually wrote this fierce anti-slavery clause. He accused King George of waging cruel war against human nature itself by carrying people into slavery. But of course, that powerful clause was ultimately scrapped just to appease the delegates from the southern colonies. So, to keep their incredibly fragile new union from falling apart, the delegates basically baked slavery indirectly right into the 1787 Constitution. Article 1 counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. Article 4 mandated the return of persons held in service or labor. And they even explicitly protected the international slave trade until at least 1808. It was a cold political calculation, appeasing the South while kicking an inevitable, devastating moral reckoning down the road. Because of those deep early shortcomings, a lot of modern scholars and historical giants like Frederick Douglass look at the post-Civil War Reconstruction era as a sort of second founding of the Republic. This is the era that brought us the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, establishing equal protection, expanding voting rights. This was the real turning point where the nation finally started, actually trying to live up to those original ideals they wrote down. So taking all of that in, we have to step back and look at the big picture. We've traveled from the myth of these flawless demigods to the reality of wealthy lawyers, brilliant women, enslaved patriots, razor-thin compromises, and some truly devastating moral contradictions, which leaves us with one massive question to chew on. Is the American experiment just some finished relic from 1787, or is it a continuous living project that we're literally still building today? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.